3 nights ago, my wife Sylvia pushed my hand off her shoulder and told me not to touch her. I looked at her in the darkness and said one word, never. Then I added, not tonight, not ever. I'm done. She scoffed, rolled over, and went to sleep. I didn't. I lay there until 3 in the morning, making final decisions, and by dawn, I was gone. The house was empty when she woke up, and I had vanished without a trace. What Sylvia didn't know yet was that I'd been methodically preparing for this exact moment for 11 months. Every document signed, every asset protected, every conversation recorded, all unnoticed while she trusted me completely. I wasn't just leaving a marriage, I was executing a plan she'd never seen coming.
Nothing about the beginning felt dramatic, and that's exactly why I missed what it was becoming. Because when something dangerous enters your life quietly, it doesn't trigger fear, it triggers rationalization. At first, it looked like normal friction, the kind people tell you every long-term relationship goes through, small disagreements about priorities, subtle shifts in tone, moments where conversations felt unfinished but not explosive enough to revisit. And I told myself this was maturity, that not every discomfort needed to be interrogated, that choosing calm over confrontation was a sign of growth. But slowly, that calm started to feel less like peace and more like suspension, as if everything important was being deferred to a later moment that never arrived. I noticed that clarity was fading in ways I couldn't easily explain, details changing slightly from one conversation to the next, explanations that made sense individually but didn't quite align when placed side by side. And instead of challenging those inconsistencies, I adjusted to them, assuming I was tired, distracted, overthinking, because it's far easier to doubt your perception than to accept that something foundational may be unstable. There was no single lie I could point to, no obvious betrayal, just a growing sense that I was operating inside a narrative that wasn't entirely mine anymore, responding instead of initiating, reacting instead of deciding. And the more I tried to restore equilibrium by being flexible, understanding, patient, the more that equilibrium drifted further away, as if the rules were being rewritten in real time and I was always a step behind. What unsettled me most wasn't conflict, but the absence of it, the way difficult topics dissolved before they could fully form, how concerns were acknowledged just enough to diffuse them without ever being resolved, creating a strange psychological fog where nothing was wrong enough to confront and nothing felt solid enough to trust. I started replaying conversations in my head, not to win arguments, but to reassure myself that they'd even happened the way I remembered. And that's when I realized something important had shifted. Because when you start auditing your own memory instead of the situation, you've already ceded ground. Still, I didn't panic, because panic requires certainty, and uncertainty is far more paralyzing. It keeps you functional while quietly eroding your confidence. And that's what allowed everything to continue as long as it did, because from the outside, my life still looked intact, orderly, successful even, while internally I was managing an increasing number of invisible variables: tone, timing, phrasing, what not to say, what could wait, what might escalate things unnecessarily. I wasn't planning anything yet, not in the way people imagine planning. I was just paying attention in a way I hadn't before, noting patterns without assigning meaning to them, storing moments without labeling them as evidence. Because at this stage, I still wanted to believe, that there was a reasonable explanation for everything, that clarity would eventually return on its own if I stayed steady long enough. What I didn't understand then was that ambiguity isn't neutral, it favors whoever is shaping it. And by the time I felt that something truly consequential was forming beneath the surface, I was already too invested to step back cleanly, too embedded in a version of reality that no longer felt fully reliable. What Sylvia didn't know yet was that I'd been methodically preparing for this exact moment for 11 months.
The moment doubt stops feeling abstract and starts influencing your behavior, it quietly becomes a force of its own. And that was the phase I entered without realizing it, because I wasn't reacting to a crisis yet. I was reacting to discomfort,
the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but changes how you move through ordinary days. I found myself choosing words more carefully, not out of strategy but caution, replaying neutral exchanges afterward to check for unintended meanings, wondering why I felt relief when conversations ended instead of connection, and telling myself this was temporary stress, external pressure, anything but the possibility that the environment itself had shifted. What made it harder was that nothing I could point to was overtly malicious. There were no dramatic accusations, no explosive arguments, just subtle reframings, moments where my intentions were gently reinterpreted, where concerns I raised were acknowledged but somehow returned to me as misunderstandings I needed to resolve internally. And over time, that creates a strange imbalance, because you're expending energy to correct perceptions that never fully stabilize. I started noticing how often I was explaining myself for things that hadn't required explanation before, clarifying tone, context, motivation, as if neutrality had become suspicious. And even then, I hesitated to label it manipulation, because manipulation implies intent, and intent is difficult to prove when everything is wrapped in reasonableness. The most unsettling realization wasn't that I was being challenged, but that I was being gently guided away from trusting my instincts, encouraged, subtly, to rely on external validation instead of internal judgment, which is an incredibly effective way to disarm someone without ever confronting them directly. Still, I resisted drawing conclusions because certainty felt dangerous too early, and I didn't want to become paranoid or unfair. So instead, I did what many people do when clarity is missing. I observed, quietly, inconsistently at first, then with more discipline, not taking notes, not building a case, just noticing how often my memory of events differed slightly from the version being presented back to me, how often timelines blurred, how often I was told something wasn't what I thought, even when I was sure of what I'd heard. That's when doubt began to shift from something happening to me into something I could use, not as proof, but as direction, a signal that my usual assumptions about trust and transparency might no longer apply. I didn't feel confident or empowered by this realization. I felt cautious, because paying attention means accepting the possibility that you won't like what you see, and that once you see it, you can't unsee it. I also understood, instinctively, that confronting anything prematurely would be a mistake, because situations like this don't collapse under pressure, they adapt, and the person who moves too early often exposes themselves instead. So I stayed quiet, not because I was sure of anything, but because uncertainty demanded patience, and patience, in this context, felt like the only form of control I had left. I began asking myself different questions, not what's wrong, but what stays consistent and what changes depending on who's listening. And those questions didn't give me answers right away, but they gave me a framework, a way to navigate the fog without pretending it wasn't there. I still hoped things would stabilize, that clarity would return naturally, that this was just a phase that would resolve itself if I didn't overreact. But underneath that hope was a quieter realization forming, one that made sleep lighter and conversations heavier. The sense that whatever was unfolding wasn't accidental, and that if I waited too long for certainty, the narrative might be written for me before I ever understood the rules.
Have you ever stayed quiet to avoid making things worse, only to realize later that your silence was being used to rewrite the story without you? That's exactly where I found myself, and at first, I didn't even recognize the danger because nothing dramatic was happening on the surface. No shouting, no ultimatums, no obvious betrayal, just a slow, unsettling shift in tone, in behavior, in the way conversations seemed to end without resolution, but somehow still left me feeling blamed. I told myself staying calm was the mature thing to do, that not reacting would prevent unnecessary conflict, especially at this stage of life when stability feels fragile and reputation matters more than ego. But what I didn't see was how silence doesn't pause a narrative, it hands control of it to the loudest or most composed person in the room. Small moments started adding up, texts left unanswered just long enough to feel intentional, conversations that were later referenced differently than I remembered, jokes made in front of others that carried a subtle edge, enough to sting but not enough to confront without seeming paranoid. And every time I chose not to correct it, not to clarify, not to push back, I felt a strange relief, followed immediately by a deeper unease, because part of me sensed that something was being shaped while I stood still. The hardest part wasn't the doubt creeping in, it was the fear of overreacting, the adult insecurity that if you question too much, you look insecure, jealous, unstable, and those labels stick far longer than facts ever do. I began replaying interactions in my head late at night, not obsessively, but carefully, noticing patterns I'd ignored before, how accountability was always vague, how responsibility was shared when it benefited her and individualized when it pointed toward me, how apologies came wrapped in explanations that subtly justified the behavior instead of correcting it. Still, I stayed quiet, convincing myself that time would reveal the truth, that consistency would expose contradictions, because surely manipulation couldn't survive patience. But patience, I learned, can be mistaken for permission. People started responding to me differently, not colder exactly, just more cautiously, like they were bracing for something I didn't know had already been said. And that's when the real fear set in, the fear that the version of events circulating without my input was becoming the accepted one. I felt trapped between two adult fears that don't get talked about enough, the fear of confronting too early and confirming suspicions, and the fear of waiting too long and losing credibility altogether. Because once doubt takes root socially, it doesn't need proof to grow, it just needs repetition. I stopped sharing details, stopped venting, stopped asking questions that could be interpreted as insecurity, and instead, I started watching who said what, to whom and when, how stories subtly changed depending on the audience, how concern was expressed publicly while accountability disappeared privately. And what scared me wasn't discovering dishonesty, it was realizing how easily ambiguity can be weaponized when one person is trying to keep the peace and the other is shaping perception. By the time I understood that my silence wasn't neutral anymore, that it was actively being interpreted, filled in, and leveraged, I also realized something worse. Whatever was coming next was already in motion, and when a situation reaches that point, staying quiet doesn't protect you, it just delays the moment you realize how far things have already gone. By the time I reached this point, the tiny inconsistencies I dismissed before had begun to form a pattern, and patterns don't lie. They only tell the story you're willing to see. It started with small financial anomalies, a statement here, a bonus unaccounted for there, deposits that didn't quite match up with what I'd expected from our shared accounts. At first, I brushed it off as oversight or bureaucracy, the kind of minor slip that happens when two people juggle complicated lives. But when I paired that with subtle behavioral shifts, her coldness during casual conversation, the way she avoided certain topics, the way plans were shifted without explanation, it became impossible to ignore. My military training kicked in, noticed the pattern, track deviations, document everything. I started keeping meticulous mental notes, recording not just events, but timing, context, and emotional cues. Every evening, I reviewed the day like an intelligence report, asking what changed, why, and how might this be leveraged against me. It wasn't paranoia, it was observation. I began cross-referencing the small financial discrepancies with conversations I remembered from months prior, noticing correlations that no one else could see. Every signature she placed on a document I hadn't examined carefully became a point of interest. Every casual remark about work or her clients was a potential insight into her mindset. Slowly, I started to reconstruct the map of her intentions, not in a vague, accusatory sense, but with surgical precision. This behavior aligns with an exit plan. That withdrawal aligns with asset protection. This display of frustration aligns with testing boundaries. It was like watching an intricate chess game unfold while everyone else assumed it was checkers.
The more I observed, the more my initial fear turned into clarity. There was no sudden betrayal, no shocking revelation. It was a slow, methodical preparation, a strategy laid out piece by piece, leaving me no room for denial. And that's when I realized something crucial. Being prepared doesn't just mean defending yourself. It means anticipating every move and staying several steps ahead. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting emotionally, I was thinking like a strategist. I created a mental ledger of behaviors, matched it with documented evidence, and began planning my own countermeasures. At this stage, it wasn't about confrontation or revenge, it was about understanding and timing. I didn't need to prove her intentions yet, I only needed to confirm the pattern and wait for the precise moment to act, knowing that every piece of her strategy contained its own vulnerabilities. That patience became my advantage. And while the house seemed quiet and the days carried on like nothing was wrong, I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. I was actively, deliberately, methodically reconstructing the reality that had been quietly unraveling around me. By the end of this period, I wasn't just aware of what was happening, I understood the full architecture of her strategy. And that understanding became the foundation of my next moves, the blueprint for every decision I would make, and the invisible armor I would wear in a war that no one outside those walls could yet see coming.
The transition from observation to action didn't arrive with drama or confrontation. It came quietly, almost invisibly, the way real shifts in power always do. I didn't announce anything, didn't change my routines in ways Sylvia might notice, didn't suddenly become distant or cold. If anything, I became more agreeable, more present, more forgettable. That was intentional. In intelligence work, the most dangerous moment is when the other side realizes something has changed, so I made sure she felt nothing at all. While she moved through her days convinced I was background noise, I began isolating pieces of my life with careful restraint, opening accounts in my name alone, transferring business assets through structures she had signed off on months earlier, and quietly separating liabilities from anything she could later claim as shared responsibility. Each step was legal, deliberate, and slow enough to blend into the normal administrative clutter she despised dealing with. I made sure every document passed through her hands casually, during breakfast, between meetings, late at night when she was exhausted, moments when her attention was elsewhere and her trust in my competence did the rest. There was a strange emotional tension in this phase, not fear exactly, but the weight of knowing that every mundane interaction now carried consequence. Every "can you sign this" was a move on a board she didn't realize she was playing on. At times, doubt crept in, not about my plan, but about myself, whether this level of calculation made me something colder than I wanted to be, whether I was crossing an internal line I couldn't uncross. But each time that hesitation surfaced, it was met by memory. Her dismissive tone, the physical recoil when I touched her, the way she spoke to me like a problem she'd already solved. That wasn't love eroding accidentally, it was intention expressed through neglect. I reminded myself that preparation wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation. Still, I wasn't omnipotent, and I knew it. Mistakes at this stage would be catastrophic, so I double-checked everything, sometimes 3 or 4 times, losing sleep over minor details that might later be questioned. I documented dates, contexts, and rationales in private logs, not because I enjoyed the process, but because ambiguity is where people like Sylvia thrive. What unsettled me most wasn't the logistics, though. It was how easy this became once I committed to it. The discipline, the patience, the emotional compartmentalization felt disturbingly familiar, like slipping back into an old uniform I thought I'd retired. Some nights, lying beside her while she slept, I stared at the ceiling, wondering whether she sensed anything at all, whether there was a flicker of intuition warning her that the man beside her was quietly detaching from the life she assumed was permanent. There wasn't. She slept soundly. That silence became confirmation. By the end of this phase, nothing had exploded, nothing had been revealed, but the ground beneath our marriage had subtly shifted. The exits were mapped, the safeguards in place, the margins of error narrowed to almost nothing. Sylvia still believed she held all the leverage. I knew better,
But the most important part was that she didn't need to know yet, not until timing, leverage, and reality aligned. The first real fracture didn't announce itself with confrontation or discovery. It surfaced quietly, almost innocently, as a detail that didn't belong where it appeared. I was reviewing our joint tax summaries late one night, not because I suspected anything specific, but because patterns demand occasional validation, and one line item refused to resolve cleanly against our known accounts. It was small enough to dismiss, the kind of discrepancy most people would wave away as a clerical delay or rounding error, but it lingered in my mind precisely because Sylvia had built her entire professional life on spotting those same inconsistencies in other people's marriages. When I asked her about it casually a few days later, she didn't hesitate. She never did, offering an explanation that was smooth, practiced, and just vague enough to sound reasonable without inviting further discussion. I nodded, accepted it outwardly, and filed the moment away internally, aware that the most telling tells are not emotional reactions, but how quickly someone moves on from a question they should have lingered over. From that point forward, I began looking backward instead of forward, retracing financial footprints with the patience I'd learned overseas, comparing timelines, cross-referencing deposits against known income cycles, watching how bonuses were distributed and where they failed to appear. The process wasn't dramatic. It was slow, technical, and deeply unsettling in a way that crept rather than struck, because with every confirmed detail, the implication grew heavier. What I felt wasn't rage or betrayal yet. It was a dull, tightening pressure in my chest, the kind that comes when an assumption you've lived inside for years starts to deform. There was one moment in particular that still stands out. A mid-afternoon signing at the kitchen counter, Sylvia, half distracted, phone pressed between shoulder and ear, absent-mindedly initialing a document that cleanly separated a future liability from my business without reading a word of it. She laughed at something on the call, slid the paper back toward me, and went on with her day, completely unaware that the distance she'd cultivated between us was now working against her. That was when the emotional reality finally pierced the strategic shell. I realized she didn't just trust me, she had stopped seeing me as someone worth monitoring. That knowledge hurt more than any argument ever had. Still, I forced myself to slow down rather than accelerate, because discovery creates temptation and premature action exposes intent. Instead, I let the unease sit with me, observing how easily she dismissed shared planning, how reflexively she framed everything as handled, how little curiosity she showed about a life we were supposedly still building together. The more I saw, the clearer it became that whatever separation I was preparing for, she had been rehearsing her own version far longer than I'd allowed myself to imagine. And yet nothing outward changed. No accusations, no confrontations, no raised voices. Only an internal shift from theoretical preparation to confirmed necessity. By the end of this phase, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was verifying, and the difference between those two states is profound. Guessing leaves room for hope. Verification does not. Once verification replaced doubt, the hardest part wasn't uncovering more information. It was doing nothing with what I already knew. Silence became a discipline. I stopped asking questions entirely, stopped checking facts aloud, stopped offering suggestions or opinions that might invite scrutiny, because the moment someone senses they're being observed, the data degrades. Sylvia thrived on control, on being the smartest person in the room, and the surest way to preserve her patterns was to let her believe nothing had changed. So I leaned into absence, into neutrality, into becoming predictable again. I cooked when I always cooked, listened when she spoke about cases without asking follow-ups, nodded at explanations that no longer required belief, and let the space between us widen naturally instead of resisting it. From the outside, the marriage appeared stagnant but stable. From the inside, it felt like watching a structure collapse in slow motion while pretending not to notice the cracks. This was when patience stopped feeling like strategy and started feeling like endurance. There were nights I lay awake replaying details, tempted to accelerate, tempted to confront, tempted to force clarity through impact, but impact would have favored her.
She was a litigator. Conflict was her terrain. Time, however, was mine. Every week that passed without reaction reinforced her assumption that I was still operating under the old rules, trusting, disengaged, harmless. That assumption became the shield behind which everything else happened. I began documenting without dramatizing dates, behaviors, tonal shifts, decisions made unilaterally and framed as mutual, the quiet contempt that surfaced in small dismissals rather than arguments. Nothing illegal, nothing invasive, just a clear record of what it feels like when a partner slowly erases you without ever formally leaving. Emotionally, this phase was the most corrosive because it required me to live inside the lie longer than was necessary for truth, but necessary for outcome. I wasn't numb, I was restrained. I felt the loss in mundane moments, setting 2 plates out of habit, saving articles I realized I'd never send, noticing how quickly she exited rooms I entered, but I trained myself not to react to those moments, only to register them. There was a strange clarity in that restraint, a recognition that grief doesn't always arrive with tears or collapse. Sometimes it arrives as a cold, sustained awareness that the version of your life you were protecting no longer exists. Sylvia didn't notice the shift because to her nothing had changed. I had already been background noise for years. That realization hardened something in me. Not anger, not cruelty, but resolve. I wasn't planning revenge, I was preparing insulation. By the end of this period, I understood that the quiet wasn't passive at all. It was active concealment, the kind that lets the other party keep moving exactly as they always have. And the more normal everything felt on the surface, the more certain I became that when the moment came, it would feel sudden only to her. The silence broke in a way I hadn't predicted, not with confrontation or discovery, but with something far more dangerous: curiosity. It started small enough to be dismissible if I'd wanted to lie to myself, a casual question asked too late at night, phrased as an afterthought, about why I'd suddenly become so organized, so attentive to details I used to ignore. The timing was wrong. Curiosity, when it arrives naturally, is sloppy and impatient. This was measured, rehearsed, like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. From that moment on, the environment shifted. Patterns I had been tracking for months began to warp, schedules adjusted by minutes, phone calls ended sooner than usual. A device that normally lived face down on the counter started disappearing into pockets when I entered the room. None of this was proof, but proof was never the danger. Awareness was. I understood then that the luxury of passive observation was over. The system I'd been quietly mapping could now react, and once a system adapts, it becomes unpredictable. That realization forced a decision I'd been delaying. I moved from recording to committing. I stopped merely watching transactions and initiated a minor financial transfer, insignificant in scale but permanent in implication, a line crossed that couldn't be erased without consequence. I scheduled meetings I could no longer cancel without explanation. I placed documents where their existence would matter, even if I never used them. Each action tightened the frame, reduced my own maneuvering room, and that was intentional. Because control isn't about unlimited options, it's about choosing constraints that favor you. The psychological cost hit harder than I expected. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not about the facts, but about timing. Move too early and you expose intent. Move too late and you lose initiative. There is no clean window, only windows that close slower than others. I slept less. I replayed conversations not for what was said, but for what was almost said. I noticed how quickly people sense a shift in gravity, even if they can't name it. And then came the confirmation, subtle but unmistakable. A harmless request for paperwork I knew already existed, asked in a tone that assumed I wouldn't check too closely. That was the tell. Not malice, not anger. Assumption. Assumption is what people rely on when they believe the other side is still unaware. In that moment, the balance changed.
The game was no longer about whether something was happening, it was about who understood the shape of it better. I didn't feel victorious, I felt exposed, sharpened, fully present in a way that strips comfort from your bones. This wasn't dominance, it was commitment. From here on, every move would create a wake. There would be no more neutral ground, no more pretending this was theoretical. Whatever happened next would happen because I chose to let it, or because I failed to act fast enough. And that understanding, clear, cold, irreversible, was the true beginning of the endgame.
Escalation doesn't announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrives quietly, disguised as normalcy, stretched just a little too thin, and by the time most people notice, they're already reacting instead of deciding. After the first disturbance, I became deliberate about silence. Not absence, but restraint. Because nothing accelerates suspicion faster than visible urgency. I maintained routines, kept my tone even, and let conversations end naturally, while underneath that surface, I began compressing timelines that had once been flexible. Tasks I'd planned to spread over months were pulled inward, not rushed, but layered, each one designed to function independently if the others were compromised. I duplicated records and stored them where their value didn't depend on my presence. I changed nothing that could be pointed to as defensive, yet everything that mattered was now insulated against denial, delay, or disappearance. What changed most was my internal posture. Observation had been passive, preparation was active. And activity creates friction you can feel in your body before it shows up anywhere else. I became aware of how often people probe indirectly when they sense control slipping, through casual remarks, misplaced humor, questions framed as concern, and I stopped answering the questions behind the questions. Every response became precise, boring, unremarkable, because drama feeds on explanation, and I wasn't feeding anything anymore. The environment responded the way systems always do when pressure is applied unevenly, inconsistently. One day there was warmth where there should have been indifference. The next day, distance where familiarity used to sit. These weren't emotional swings, they were calibrations, someone testing whether the old assumptions still held. That inconsistency confirmed what no single fact could, that the situation was now dynamic, and dynamics punish hesitation. I introduced controlled friction of my own, deadlines that required acknowledgement, paperwork that couldn't be postponed without leaving a trace, conversations that forced positions without revealing mine. None of it was aggressive, but all of it narrowed escape routes. The psychological strain came not from fear, but from discipline. Acting too soon would collapse the structure. Acting too late would mean acting from weakness. I learned to tolerate that tension, to treat it as a signal rather than a threat. There were moments, small, fleeting, when I caught flashes of recognition in her eyes, followed immediately by dismissal, as if the mind itself rejected the implication, because accepting it would require too many questions. That rejection was useful. It bought time. And time, when you're shaping outcomes instead of chasing them, becomes leverage. By the end of this phase, nothing explosive had happened, and that was the point. No confrontation, no exposure, no dramatic turn, just a quiet rebalancing where the system no longer moved freely, and neither of us could pretend it did. The escalation was real, but it left no fingerprints, no scene, no single moment to point to, only a growing sense that the ground beneath us had shifted, and that whatever came next would not be accidental. By the time I entered this phase, the battle was no longer about observation or doubt. It had become about precise execution, and every single action I took was designed to cement the advantage I had painstakingly built over the past 11 months. Nothing happened by accident, nothing was left to chance, and every detail had been anticipated, mapped, and cataloged in ways that would be invisible to anyone else, even to someone as meticulous as Sylvia. Every document I relocated, every account I separated, every email and backup I duplicated existed not for immediate gain, but as a layer of protection, a shield against uncertainty, and a lever I could pull when the time was right.
I understood early on that showing force too soon would trigger resistance, so I became invisible, quietly reordering the landscape around us without ever tipping my hand, letting her believe the world remained exactly as it had always been. My communication became surgical, short, factual, and entirely unemotional, yet each word was placed with the intent to reinforce my position, to gather information, and to mislead without ever lying outright. Simultaneously, I watched patterns of behavior with a hawk's precision, how she scheduled her day, what cues triggered frustration, which routines were rigid and which could be bent, and used that knowledge to predict where I could maneuver freely and where any misstep could alert her prematurely. Psychological advantage was far more critical than any physical preparation. Every act of patience and restraint amplified the impact of the moves I made, ensuring that when the confrontation came, it would be on my terms and not hers. I let small openings appear, carefully calculated, giving the illusion that control still rested in her hands, only to watch those assumptions crumble when the invisible structure I had built held firm. Each action was layered in redundancy: financial safeguards, account separations, document archives, witness preparation, and preemptive narratives, so that even if one element were discovered or challenged, the overall plan remained intact, unshakable, and unquestionable. I resisted emotional reaction constantly, because even a flicker of irritation or anxiety could be read, and in this game, perception is as dangerous as reality. I maintained absolute composure, letting uncertainty settle over her like a fog, while I operated in clarity and precision, turning time into an ally instead of an enemy. By the close of this module, the landscape was fully prepared, the financial threads untouchable, evidence irrefutable, potential witnesses ready, and every interaction mapped and anticipated. Outwardly, nothing appeared different. The house, the routines, even Sylvia herself seemed unchanged. The advantage, however, was complete, invisible, and waiting silently, ready to be deployed at the precise moment to alter everything. It was a quiet certainty, built through methodical patience, meticulous preparation, and ruthless strategy, that when the next phase began, it would not be a reaction, but a decisive strike that would redefine the rules of the game entirely, and she would realize too late that the advantage I had cultivated in secret was absolute, inescapable, and entirely mine. By the time I reached this stage, everything I had done over the past 11 months, the careful documentation of every interaction, every financial discrepancy, every subtle shift in her behavior, every late-night conversation she thought was private, and every small, seemingly insignificant signature she had carelessly appended to documents without reading, had to be maintained with almost surgical precision, because the margin for error was vanishingly small. Any slip, any premature reveal, any hint of anticipation on my part could alert her, and Sylvia's instincts were razor-sharp, honed over decades of building and dismantling other people's lives in court, meaning she would immediately detect even the slightest irregularity and react with a combination of speed and force I could not afford to underestimate. Each morning I woke with the weight of vigilance, reviewing emails, cross-referencing bank statements, confirming the integrity of my hidden accounts, and double-checking the videos I had recorded, 27 in total, each time-stamped, each carefully cataloged, to ensure that my narrative could not be challenged. Because although they were simple recordings of my own experiences, they represented irrefutable evidence of her disengagement, her contempt, and, in one particularly revealing sequence, her attempts to manipulate those around her without any regard for the truth. I watched the patterns of her daily life, noting how she approached her work with calculated intensity, how she interacted with her colleagues, and how she subtly projected control over her environment in ways that reminded me uncomfortably of the predator versus prey dynamics I had studied for years in the field, because the marriage had long since transformed from a partnership into a battleground of strategy. And now every move I made had to anticipate not just her legal skill, but the psychological games she could play, the narratives she could spin, and the alliances she could quietly cultivate. And yet, Despite the tension, there was a strange clarity in this stage, an almost cold satisfaction that came from understanding that, for once, I was operating from a position of absolute preparation rather than reaction. Every step was deliberate, every choice calculated, and every eventuality accounted for. From the hidden $138,000 she had set aside, to the documents I had secured, to the sworn testimony of Ken and the corroboration of Vanessa Sterling, all waiting for the precise moment when the narrative she had carefully built for herself and for the court would be systematically dismantled by the facts I had painstakingly gathered. I moved through each day with the discipline of an intelligence officer, maintaining the appearance of routine while simultaneously orchestrating the timing of her exposure, knowing that the greater the illusion of normalcy, the more shocking the eventual reveal would be. Because Sylvia was not just a lawyer, she was a master of perception, and if I allowed even a flicker of impatience or pride to show, she would detect it immediately and counteract it with a legal precision honed over decades. And so, I maintained the delicate balance, reviewing evidence, confirming accounts, revisiting recorded conversations, and reminding myself that this was not about revenge, not about malice, but about reclaiming control, dignity, and truth. Because when the time came for exposure, every carefully orchestrated element, the hidden accounts, the video documentation, the sworn statements, and the strategic legal counsel would converge in a way that would leave no doubt about her intentions, her preparation, and the cold reality of how deeply disengaged she had become. And yet, despite the exhaustive preparation and meticulous attention to detail, I had to move as if I were still vulnerable, as if every move could be challenged, every action scrutinized, because the greatest strength in all of this was not just what I had done, but the impression I left, calm, measured, and untouchable, until the precise moment when the truth would strike, irrevocable, and finally expose the reality she had tried so long to hide.
By the time I reached this stage, every decision, every observation, every quiet adjustment I had made over the past 11 months had converged into a single, unshakable trajectory. There was no turning back. The house still slept under the pretense of normalcy, unaware that the next hours would redefine every expectation, every assumption I had once shared with Sylvia. I moved with the precision and patience honed over 22 years in military intelligence, reviewing each document, each discreetly logged financial anomaly, each pattern of behavior I had cataloged, knowing the moment of exposure had to be exact, unassailable, and complete. I wasn't acting on emotion, I was executing strategy, letting the weight of the months of observation and preparation give form to what had previously existed only in planning. As dawn broke and the first rays of light spilled across the kitchen counter, I paused to consider the gravity of what was about to unfold. This was no longer rehearsal. Every phone call ignored, every account separation, every document silently shifted into place had been calculated not for revenge, but for absolute protection of myself and my future. I knew Sylvia's immediate perception would be that of shock and confusion, but my own awareness told me that would only delay her understanding, not diminish it. She would never have anticipated that someone so intimately familiar with her tactics could mirror them with equal, if not greater, skill. Even as I packed essentials and reviewed final digital copies of meticulously organized evidence, I felt a strange clarity, a calm that was almost dizzying because I recognized that all of this, years of strategic patience, subtle testing of boundaries, and careful documentation, was culminating in a single point of irreversible action. There was no going back, no possibility of retreat. The preparation phase was complete, and the ignition key had been turned. Every habit I had honed, the patience to let her underestimate me, the restraint to wait until the timing was precise, the ability to observe without revealing my own hand, now bore fruit in the certainty of outcome. I allowed myself one brief reflection. In the quiet intensity of that morning, I recognized that control had shifted entirely into my hands, not through aggression, but through knowledge, awareness, and deliberate execution. Sylvia would wake, and the reality of her world would fracture with the precision I had designed. This module, this critical hinge, was not about immediate confrontation. It was about laying the groundwork so thoroughly that when exposure came, it would feel both inevitable and unassailable. And as I closed the laptop, reviewing the final checks on accounts, recordings, and documents, I understood fully that the audience of one, the world she believed she controlled, would soon see that preparation had become consequence. I moved through the motions with an almost surgical calm, knowing that the next step would no longer be about watching and waiting, but about exposure, action, and the irreversible shift from being contained within a failing marriage to commanding the terms of its conclusion. In that deliberate stillness, I allowed the tension to settle, the weight of all preceding months pressing down, because every action from this moment forward would resonate with the authority of a plan executed flawlessly, and every consequence, every shock to her controlled narrative would begin here, in the quiet precision of Module 12, the ignition point where preparation ends and reality begins to bend. The morning Sylvia discovered the absence of her husband was nothing short of catastrophic for her carefully maintained sense of control. I watched from a discreet distance, the rules I had spent months crafting unfolding with precision. The duffel bag at the door, the laptop gone, the drawers emptied of my personal documents, each absence a silent statement, a calculated shock. Her initial disbelief quickly hardened into anger, the first visible cracks in a persona that had been meticulously polished for decades. Calls and texts flooded my phone, dozens of them in minutes, but I let them ring, each one building her own uncertainty, each one amplifying the psychological leverage that months of observation and preparation had quietly stacked in my favor. In the motel room, coffee in hand, I reviewed final copies of accounts, statements, and recordings, allowing myself only the briefest reflection on the gravity of what I was about to unleash. There was a cold clarity in knowing that every move I had made was both defensive and offensive, protecting what was mine while simultaneously exposing what she had hidden, a revelation that would dismantle her narrative piece by piece. The hidden accounts, the separate financial strategies, the documentation of her disengagement, and the careful cataloging of her coldest behaviors all converged into a single actionable dossier, ready for the precise moment of deployment. Each interaction, from the voicemail I deleted immediately to the texts she assumed I hadn't seen, became part of a larger psychological chessboard. I controlled not only the facts, but the tempo, letting anxiety and confusion dictate her responses, while I remained composed, strategic, untouchable in focus. By the time legal counsel began the formal process of serving notice and freezing joint accounts, the impact had already begun to ripple outward. Colleagues, friends, and family, all witnessing the first cracks in a marriage that Sylvia had long believed she orchestrated perfectly. Watching her attempt to reconcile the reality with her expectations, seeing her calculations unravel under pressure, reinforced the principle that preparation is only half the battle. Timing and execution complete the equation. My daughter's awareness of the situation had to be managed carefully, a buffer between emotional honesty and tactical necessity, ensuring that her perspective remained grounded even as Sylvia's narrative of chaos tried to take hold. And through it all, I remained calm, allowing my strategic patience to transform into the first undeniable exposure of truth, that my withdrawal, my precise actions were not acts of malice, but instruments of clarity, revealing years of deception, disengagement, and hidden motives. In the courtroom and the office, every carefully curated document, every secretly recorded observation, every calculated financial maneuver coalesced into a reality she could no longer manipulate, a narrative controlled entirely by evidence and strategic foresight. By evening, after the initial shock had set in, the first tremors of consequence were unmistakable. She realized that the game had changed, that the spouse she had underestimated for decades had moved beyond mere survival into absolute control, and that every step I had taken, measured and deliberate, was about to rewrite the rules entirely.
Module 13 does not end in resolution. It ends in exposure, the first tangible shift from preparation into action, from strategy into consequence, and from hidden awareness into the stark reality that control is no longer shared but wholly owned by the one who planned, waited, and struck with precision.
The day the legal wheels began turning, the atmosphere around Sylvia shifted instantly. A subtle but unmistakable tension radiating from her colleagues, the court staff, and even her law partners, each of whom had come to expect her ironclad control over every situation. Yet, as I watched from the perimeter, every calculated document I had prepared, every hidden account uncovered, every time-stamped recording of my own experiences within the marriage began to fracture the illusion she had meticulously maintained, turning the invisible threads of strategy I had woven over the past 11 months into tangible leverage. And it became clear that this was no longer just about protecting my assets or safeguarding my dignity. It was about asserting control in a battle she had long assumed she dominated. And as I met with Blackwood, reviewing the carefully compiled dossiers of evidence, financial statements revealing 2 hidden accounts totaling $221,000, meticulously documented patterns of her disengagement, and the formal, notarized statements of Ken Patterson and Vanessa Sterling confirming attempts at infidelity and professional manipulation, I felt the gravity of what was about to unfold, knowing that each piece of evidence not only contradicted her carefully constructed narrative, but also exposed a level of premeditation she had never anticipated facing. And when we filed the emergency motions to freeze joint assets and formally serve notice, the immediate impact was palpable, with calls from her law partners, frantic texts from Sylvia herself, and the subtle ripple of whispers in court corridors, all while I remained composed, my demeanor calm, each interaction a deliberate psychological move, letting uncertainty take root in her mind while I observed, cataloged, and prepared the next phase of the engagement. And even as her narrative tried to paint me as rash or unstable, the incontrovertible evidence, hidden money, documented disinterest, and her prior attempts to manipulate friends and colleagues spoke louder than any accusation she could levy, creating a strategic imbalance that she was forced to confront in real time, all while I maintained careful boundaries with Ainsley, ensuring she understood enough to grasp the seriousness of the situation without being dragged into the manipulative theatrics her mother attempted to spin. And when preliminary hearings began, every carefully crafted folder, every time-stamped email, and every recorded observation was deployed with precision, demonstrating not only my foresight, but also the contrast between calculated action and reactive desperation. And in those moments, as the judge reviewed the initial filings and asset protections, the shift was unmistakable. The spouse who had long held control was now reacting, scrambling, and exposed, her professional facade showing cracks that months of preparation had predicted. And yet, even in this exposure, there was no triumphalism, only a disciplined patience, a deliberate pace that let every element of evidence land, every motion gain weight, and every strategic advantage crystallize into irrevocable consequence, setting the stage for the next stage of the conflict, where the psychological game would intensify, allies would be leveraged, and the narrative she had counted on would be fully dismantled, leaving no room for obfuscation or manipulation. And as the day concluded, I reflected on the transformation, the shift from careful preparation to irrevocable execution, from hidden knowledge to deliberate exposure, and from anticipation to action, knowing that the real test, the full unmasking of truth, the public confrontation with evidence, and the final dismantling of the false narrative was only just beginning. With every legal maneuver, every documented fact, and every tactical pause ensuring that the trajectory of the entire separation had been irrevocably altered in my favor.
The courtroom that morning felt like a pressure cooker, wood-paneled walls and polished floors echoing the quiet tension that had been building for weeks. As Sylvia entered with her law partner Preston, each step measured, each glance calculated. But even her practiced composure betrayed the slightest flicker of uncertainty, and I sat across from her, calm and collected, my folders of evidence meticulously arranged and ready, knowing that every detail, the 2 hidden accounts totaling $221,000, the notarized statements from Ken Patterson and Vanessa Sterling, the 27 recorded journals documenting years of emotional abandonment, would land methodically, piece by piece, dismantling the narrative she had spent years crafting for her clients and for herself. While Blackwood guided me, whispering instructions only I could hear, advising exactly when to sit, when to respond, when silence would speak louder than words. And as the judge called the hearing to order, Sylvia began, her voice firm but slightly strained, presenting her claims of sudden abandonment, alleged financial deprivation, and the emotional impact of my departure. And I listened, cataloging every inflection, every attempt to manipulate perception, every rhetorical flourish designed to evoke sympathy, until it was my turn, and with steady composure I presented the evidence that proved a starkly different reality. Accounts concealed for years, patterns of disengagement, documented attempts to manipulate friends, colleagues, and even Annesley. The timing of deposits and behaviors all pointing to premeditation on her part, not mine. And with each point, the weight shifted subtly yet undeniably, the courtroom energy changing as the judge scanned documents, noting inconsistencies, recognizing strategic concealment, while Preston's usually confident posture began to tighten, Sylvia's mask of authority fracturing imperceptibly but clearly to any trained observer. And when we introduced the sworn statements and corroborated emails, the impact was immediate, leaving no room for doubt about the intentionality behind her actions. And yet, even as I presented facts that could have been inflammatory if mishandled, I maintained an unflappable calm, allowing the contrast between my composure and her reactive energy to speak volumes, creating psychological leverage that extended beyond the legal arguments themselves. All while Blackwood navigated procedural moves, objecting only when necessary, guiding the judge's focus toward verifiable facts and away from emotional diversion. And by the time preliminary discussions concluded, the subtle but irreversible shift was complete. Sylvia's professional confidence was visibly shaken, her narrative challenged at its core, and the leverage I had accumulated over months of careful observation and preparation had crystallized into strategic dominance, not through aggression, but through precision, patience, and the disciplined application of evidence. And as we exited the courtroom, Sylvia's restraint gave way to quiet fury, her controlled expressions faltering even as she attempted to mask them, while I felt a measured satisfaction, knowing that the battle had been waged on my terms, that every risk had been mitigated, and that the path toward a fair and dignified resolution, protecting assets, maintaining integrity, and safeguarding Annesley from unnecessary exposure, was firmly in place, setting the stage for the final negotiations, the sealing of the agreement, and the ultimate dismantling of the illusion that had dominated our marriage for years, leaving no ambiguity about who had prepared, who had executed, and who had emerged from the confrontation not only intact, but strategically and psychologically unassailable. By the time the courthouse doors closed behind me, I felt an unfamiliar lightness, the kind that comes not from victory alone, but from meticulous preparation meeting opportunity, a clarity born of patience, calculation, and discipline. The settlement had been finalized on my terms, hidden accounts acknowledged, joint assets secured, Annesley shielded from the chaos, and my personal and professional life intact. And yet, there was no gloating, no sense of triumph over Sylvia personally, only the satisfaction that the years of careful observation, documentation, and strategic patience had paid off, that every small decision, every hidden note, every video journal recorded in quiet desperation had served a purpose, culminating in a resolution that was legally sound and morally defensible. And as I walked to my car, the crisp autumn air cutting through the tension, I reflected on how much I had learned about loyalty, patience, and timing, realizing that in marriage, as in intelligence work, control comes not from force, but from information and the disciplined application of strategy. and that walking away with dignity intact was itself a skill that required courage, foresight, and emotional self-control, lessons I intended to carry forward into this new chapter of life. For the first time in years, feeling unburdened by resentment or obligation, free to rebuild routines, explore new personal boundaries, and cultivate relationships untainted by past manipulation. While the echoes of Sylvia's fury and the chaos of the legal battles served as a reminder of the stakes, the careful orchestration required to navigate human complexity and the value of patience over impulse, and as I returned home to a space that now truly felt like mine, organized, secure, and calm, my phone buzzed with a message from Ansley, a simple photograph of my book on display at a London bookstore, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of the path we had both survived, a reminder that truth, methodically documented and courageously executed, could not only protect but also inspire. And as I reflected on the months of preparation, execution, and emotional restraint, I realized the story was far from over, because every ending is also a beginning. And while this chapter of my life concluded with the legal dissolution of a marriage and the reclamation of personal agency, the principles I had honed, observation, documentation, strategy, and patience, would guide me in future challenges, whether personal, professional, or relational. And as I looked ahead, I felt anticipation rather than fear, curiosity rather than regret, and a desire to share these insights with others who might find themselves trapped in similarly complex situations, which is exactly what the next video will explore. How to recognize when loyalty becomes self-destruction, when stepping away is the strongest move you can make, and how to execute that exit with precision and dignity, ensuring that you retain control, integrity, and peace of mind, leaving viewers not just satisfied with the conclusion of this story, but eager to learn the tactical and psychological strategies for reclaiming their own lives, protecting what matters most, and moving forward with confidence, leaving behind what no longer serves them. Because the ultimate power lies in knowing when to hold on, when to act, and when to walk away, and in doing so, transforming apparent endings into strategic beginnings.